Hey, welcome to the Leadership Network Microchurch Next online summit. We're thrilled that you're investing this hour today. It's going to be incredible. I know right now we're literally gathering from all over the world into this online space to discover and dive into the topic of microchurches. I'm Rob Wegner. I'm one of the directors of the Kansas City Underground. This is my buddy, one of my best friends, also one of the directors of the Kansas City Underground. Introduce yourself.
I'm Brian Johnson.
Hey, great job.
Thank you. I feel affirmed. I'm ready to go, man. I'm ready to go.
I am too. And here's why we're gathering. This missional conversation in the West, it's been snowballing for decades. There is a groundswell of interest and activity around microchurches, and it's exploding in the Western church. And we believe a compelling case can be made that the microchurch is in fact the original design within the pages of the New Testament. In addition, it's also been the primary expression of the church in the most significant disciple-making movements and church planting movements on the planet today in places like India and Africa and China. And now is the time for us to return to the microchurch expression in the West. And today we're going to explore the biblical reasons for that, the cultural reasons, the missiological reasons. So, Brian, what are we going to talk about today and who's going to be here?
Well, we're going to get into what is a microchurch, so definitions around that. We're going to get into why should we explore it and where could it lead if you're thinking about it from the predominant model of the church in the West, or if you're thinking about, hey, we're just starting from the streets, from the ground up. If you want to talk about how we make transitions, we're going to be talking about those things. We're going to have leaders like Hugh Halter and Brian Sanders who have been exploring and working in this paradigm for decades, and some younger expressions as well. So really excited to hear the way that they kind of get after the reasons that they've explored this. What have emerged? Some real practical stories, and I think it's going to be a great day. I think we're going to have, again, a few decades of learning and then some real fresh things that have happened over the last few years as well. So the first thing that we want to do, though, as we dive in is just tell you a little bit about the Kansas City Underground and our story. But before we get into kind of any of our definitions, we're going to just spend some time and talk about, like, what's the biblical foundation? When we look at the New Testament, what are things that we see emerge that would inform what it means to explore the microchurch paradigm? So, Rob, we're going to kick into the 4 facts of microchurches that we see in the pages of the New Testament. You go first.
Yeah, right on. I think about my experience when I first dropped into the world of a disciple-making movement in India. And prior to that, my primary experience in the church has been what you could call the traditional model, the legacy model, the contemporary model. And as I saw ordinary people making disciples who made disciples, and these simple expressions of church emerging that were led by ordinary people, they didn't own buildings. They would infect a relational network with the gospel and it would spread. And there'd be this new extended spiritual family. And about 3 or 4 years into this movement, I got the privilege of being a part of, it began to go exponential. And that experience actually made me begin to rethink how I was reading the Bible. And I began to realize, I have a certain template for church that I'm actually reading into or onto the scriptures at times.
Yeah.
And having this other more primal experience of the church as a movement opened up my eyes to see the New Testament story as a story of multiplying disciple makers and microchurches. So that leads really to the first fact, microchurch fact number 1. After Acts 8, the New Testament church began to operate almost exclusively as a decentralized network of microchurches. So in the beginning of Acts, the church had this tendency to meet and gather in these 2 social spaces, and tendency is probably the best word because there's not too much that's dogmatic about the early church. And admittedly, it defies these neat categories, but we will approximate what is described. There were the temple courts, and there was house to house. In the temple courts, the apostles taught, they performed miracles, they evangelized. In the courts, the people of God, they learned, they worshiped, they prayed, they were fellowshipping within that temple structure, and hundreds or thousands could be in that space together. But in the houses, the churches lived as an extended spiritual family and everyday gospel community. It was led by ordinary people. They were owning the mission of Jesus in the relational network. And we could call this the microchurch. The best historians looking back on the social structures of that time say they were probably a couple dozen or more people. They would gather in these multi-generational homes of the day when one was available. And it gives us a general size for the microchurch. And those houses weren't primarily about the meeting, but rather about the conversion of a relational network into a new extended spiritual family on mission together around the lordship of Jesus. And in Acts chapter 1, after the martyrdom of Stephen, the church was persecuted. The public gatherings at the temple courts were shut down. And we all know what happened at that point in time. The church ceased to exist. Wrong, right? The church continued to multiply disciples at an increasing rate across the Roman Empire. And how did that happen? Through these simple expressions of the church called the microchurch, which actually leads to the second fact about microchurches. Why don't you take that one, man?
Yeah, the second fact we would say about microchurches that we see in the pages of the New Testament are that there are these networks that emerge in cities, places like Rome and Corinth and Ephesus, Laodicea. So we can see this even at the end of Romans, chapter 16, I believe. Paul is addressing these microchurches, these house churches there, and he's saying, to this house church, I write this, or send greetings here. And so we're seeing that network in a city like Rome where they're coming together to form one larger unit. And it doesn't feel like it's the case that they're gathering in one place all the time. Like these are these families that Rob was just talking about, where Jesus has begun to inform that family. And so Paul's recognizing, hey, the church is over here at this person's house, and the church is over here at this person's house, because he's addressing people. He's not addressing an event. He's saying the church are these families that are networked together in cities. And even in the modern day, we see the same thing. So again, we mentioned that you're going to hear from Brian Sanders today, one of the founders of the Tampa Underground. In a city like that, we've seen a network of microchurches emerge. In Kansas City, our own story, we're now saying like the microchurch that is gathered in City View Farms, or the microchurch that is gathered at Homer's on a weekend that's made up of formerly incarcerated men and their families. We see these networks of these little extended spiritual families beginning to emerge in these cities. And so if we've seen it in the early days and we're seeing it now, we need to pay attention to that. And so this will take us to microchurch fact number 3. I'll let you take that one, Rob.
Once these networks of microchurches begin to emerge in a city like Rome, where leading New Testament scholar James Dunn says there is at least 5 of these microchurches that Paul refers to. And then when Paul's in Ephesus and he's training there in the hall, there's a new network of microchurches that emerges down that trade corridor that become the network of churches that get named in the book of Revelation. What we see happening then is that Paul is giving instruction not to the template of church that most of us have grown up with, but he's thinking about these little collections, these extended spiritual families. And suddenly, when you're reading Paul's instructions to those microchurch families, they start to make sense. The microchurch makes the church instructions given in the epistles much more possible and practical. And that's microchurch fact number 3. For example, consider the one another commands about community. Those are best fleshed out within a microchurch. Most people still conceive of church as a service in a building or a whole congregation of scores or hundreds or sometimes even thousands of people. Can you actually embody and live out the one another commands in a meaningful way in a service for an hour? Of course not. Can you actually live that out in a meaningful way with a congregation of hundreds or thousands that you don't actually even really know? Not really. Church is most tangible and embodied at the smallest level, not the largest level. Another great example, consider the worship instructions, where in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul talks about this open source, kind of crowdsourced way of gathering. And he says things like, hey, when you come together, everyone should bring a hymn or a word of instruction or a revelation or a tongue or an interpretation. He's envisioning everyone in the room participating, not a large corporate worship service with hundreds or thousands of people where the only participation by the vast majority is through singing. When we begin to see Paul's instructions through the lens of the microchurch, they make the most sense. So that's Microchurch fact number 3. And let's hit one more, Brian. What's number 4?
Yeah, so the last one here, microchurch fact number 4, we would say that all through the New Testament, the oikos were being converted to microchurches. So we've kind of already hit on this idea a little bit, but as we know, the oikos, that language of oikos is more than Greek yogurt, right? It's the socio-economic unit or engine of the Greco-Roman world. And these oikos, these are these large family units, anywhere from 20 to 50 to 70. They're built around a specific vocation. And if we pay close attention to the text, we see that the gospel was spreading from oikos to oikos, or from household to household. So entire households were coming to faith in Jesus. And as a result, we see this exponential factor of disciple making taking place. So in Acts 16, again, we read the story of Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opens her heart, and it says that she and her entire household were baptized. And then later in the same chapter, we see the same thing happening with the jailer, that as the Lord opens his heart, that he and his entire household were baptized. Crispus and his household. This just keeps happening over and over. And what's important to note is there exists a deep sense of family already. These people are connected in some way. Family is present, and then Jesus begins to inform these families. And we would say that if we were to tell you the story of a network of relationships in Kansas City, that's what's happened here over and over. In our own neighborhoods, we began to live deeply into those spaces, into those places, learning the stories, the songs, the festivals, the rhythms of the people in the place. We began to throw as many parties as we could. We began to get to know what is this city? Why do people love it? What do they long and hope for about it? And then as we began to listen and live deeply, developing that sense of family with those around us, we began to invite people to discover Jesus and the hope that he brings, and how his story changed our story, and how the gospel changes everything. And out of that, again, Jesus began to inform this little family. I got chills thinking about that story just now. And that's happened dozens of times over in our city. If we told you the story of Matt and Sarah, or if we told you the story of Chad and Allison, or Corey and Suze, like, these are the stories of people that have invested deeply, created a sense of family, and Jesus begins to inform that family. And that's what we saw happening in the pages of the New Testament. And we were saying, why not here? Why not now?
Amen.
So where are we headed next, Rob?
Well, in this next talk, which will be given by Brian Sanders, an OG in the microchurch world, and the Kansas City Underground is a part of the larger underground network that was started by Brian Sanders and the Tampa Underground family. He's going to ask us to look at the church again with a new set of eyes. So in the organizational expression of the church, we look at the people in the pews, and we tend to see someone we hope will be an attender, an inviter, a volunteer, a member, a giver. And those can all be very meaningful activities. But you can also engage those and never actually become a disciple maker. And Brian's going to ask us to begin to look at the people we influence as disciple makers with the unique masterpiece mission, who have the capacity to see a new extended spiritual family emerge, and what a game changer that potentially can be. So enjoy this talk from Brian Sanders.
My maybe area of experience, it has to do with microchurches and creating networks around microchurches, or really the church as a network of microchurches. So let me offer that as a paradigm or way of thinking as you guys think about growth and multiplication. Because I'm a big fan of soccer or football, I was recently turned on to a book by two researchers called Chris Anderson and David Sally, and the book is called The Numbers Game. And essentially it means to reconceive how we look at football and what it takes to become a successful, high-performing team. Now, the seminal idea of their book is essentially that football is a weak link team game. It's a weak link game. In other words, because there's so many passes that have to be strung together to score, for example, you need 8, 9, 10, 15 passes to create a moment of brilliance or kind of cash in. That actually the way to improve a team is not to add a superstar, because you have 11 players on the pitch, and you can spend all your money on one superstar, but you won't see performance. And of course these guys are statisticians, so they've gone to great lengths to make this argument that actually the way to improve a football team is to find its weaker links, its weakest players, and to improve those just slightly. And to spend your money or to go for a superstar is a mistake. They contrast this with a sport like basketball. In basketball, it's the opposite. Basketball is a strong link team game, which means that actually if you can put one superstar on the court with those and surrounded by 4 mediocre players, you have a higher chance of succeeding because of the inclusion of that superstar. It's really interesting because it makes me think about the way we do church and the way we conceive, our relationship to the church as a whole, globally, locally, nationally. Is fundamentally the church a strong link team game, or is it a weak link team game? And the truth is, we have, at least Western Christianity has committed to the belief, maybe unwittingly committed to the belief, that it's a strong link team game. We've tried to build up sort of super churches and imagined that we were gaining ground because of that, and the truth is we haven't. And we have to face that. To have 1 or 2 superlative churches in a city has not produced transformation or even discipleship in our people. What if, actually, the church is closer to something like football, and that the way to see the church as a whole and the mission of God through the church gain ground, perform better, is actually to strengthen its weakest parts, its weakest players. And so instead of thinking about these great churches and how to become a great, super big, amazing church, mega church or whatever, which is possibly the dirty little secret that all of us harbor, that we wish or want to become something like that. Instead of doing that, we started thinking about, where are our smallest expressions of the church, or even what we would consider our weakest churches, and how do we make them better, make them stronger? And if we did that, what impact would that have on the world, actually? The truth is, we can take, and I've got my little drawing here, my little depiction of just, and in my time in Europe, I think this isn't far from what I could maybe say is a typical church, that actually I have 50 people in this little building. So it's a local church with maybe 50 people. And the truth is, because we have thought of super churches as aspirational expressions of the church, like we all are hoping to be a slightly bigger church, and maybe this Western, possibly even American notion that bigger is always better. Of course, a church of 500 is better than a church of 100. Of course, a church of 1,000 is better than a church of 500. But I think we're maybe wise enough and sophisticated enough to know that can't be true. And actually, it's deeply flawed logically and theologically. To say that, to believe that, just simply bigger is better. So unfortunately, then what has that done to our little 50-person church? is it's created a kind of inferiority complex where they think, well, we're not a very good church, or we're not doing church very well. And that may actually be true. I don't want to say that every 50-person church is the sort of, gold standard for what it means to be the church. But creating this sense of aspirational failure that if I were a good church, if I were a good preacher, if we were operating correctly or had the right programs or whatever, then we would be much bigger. We would have more people. It's just flawed and problematic at its core. and creating that sense of inferiority and the scarcity around it, the way of thinking of the world and the way of thinking of the people that you have in your little congregation or your community, it just creates all kinds of unintended consequences, negative unintended consequences. If you think of the etymology of the word church, which almost all of you are going to know this, but that sort of strange Greek word ecclesia, really, if you pull it apart, etymologically, if you pull it apart, you're saying, ek, which is out, and you're saying kaleo, which is called. And so essentially, what is the church? What does that word mean? It means people that are called to do mission, to go out somehow. But then there's an implicit part of the meaning, which is to come together. It's to gather, actually. So this is the strange confluence of these ideas that the church is and was always meant to be made up of called people, called missionary people, who, of course, all that implies. To be called is to have a relationship with the one who calls. It's to have the maturity and the submission and the obedience to listen to and to be able to discern and hear the voice of the one who call you to something, to someone, to some place, to some people. And so if you think of the church that way, that actually the church is a collection of called people who have been called by Jesus into his mission somehow in the world, out into the world, called out into the world. And yet it is also a gathering. So the church then is a coming together of called people, of missionary people. Now, if you think of it that way, let's go back to our little 50-person church. Well, then actually, what are we looking at? Are we looking at an inferior version of the church? Are we looking at something that's sort of sad, isn't it, to only have 50 people? It holds 150 or something, but it only has 50 coming. And that's a struggle. And actually, then our yearning, our desire for the leadership within the church and the people within the church is just to add. It's just to see 100 people or 150 maybe involved in worship. If instead we thought of the church as called out people or missionary people, then instead what you're really looking at here is potentially 50 callings, 50 missions. If these are mature disciples of Jesus, then each of them have gifts, each of them have been placed somewhere where there's opportunity. Each of them have a voice and acumen in that place where he's called them. And so you have this incredible, actually, rich missionary potential. You go from something that is framed by scarcity to something that's really framed by abundance. Now, let's be reasonable here. I mean, the truth is, if we're thinking about growth and you thought, okay, and I have 50 people in my community, my church, and that's possibly 50 different missionary callings. And what I would say is the seed, each calling then is the seed of another church, of a new church. So let's just call those microchurches. So for every calling that a person has, that a disciple has, is the seed of a missionary commitment or engagement that could become a church. Let's call those microchurches. So then actually a church of 50, now that it's driven by what Daniel Pink would call intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation. When we say, hey, let's make our church bigger, isn't this sort of sad that we're only 50 people? Wouldn't it be great if we were 100 people? That's relying on extrinsic motivation. It's external pressure. It's the vision of the pastor, or our programs are so good, or whatever. And that's never going to really move people, particularly volunteers, really to do anything. Instead, what calling does, what it awakens, what it unlocks in us is intrinsic motivation. That is to say, I don't need you to tell me that my family is important to God, or my neighborhood is important to God, or if I have a child with disabilities, I don't need you to tell me that God cares, that the gospel means something to people who are parenting a child with disabilities, because every day I live in that reality. And all the parents I know that struggle in the same way that I do, I understand the impact that Jesus and the church and the people of God and the sacramental life of the church could have, the difference it could make in that community. That's intrinsic. So if you say, if I feel then called by God to that community, and I'm given permission to plant the church, somehow, however you want to say it, a missional community, whatever, some way to be the church for those people, and to create church for those people outside the walls of this little structure, this little physical plant, then I'm driven by something inside of me, as opposed to something you need to do to make me care about what we're into or what our current vision is. Alignment is hard, guys, particularly in the 21st century. It's really hard to get lots of people to agree to do something you came up with. And maybe that's never actually how the church was meant to be led. Instead, as servant leaders, we are simply trying to fan into flame the gifts that God has put in other people. That actually Jesus can still be the head of his church, and maybe this is one way that could work itself out. So let's be practical, though. Is a little church of 50 people really going to have 50 microchurches come out of it? 50 missionary endeavors come out of it? Probably not. And that has to do with maybe a deficit in our system, a design debt, because essentially we've made a social contract with our people that you just come here and you have a worship service once a week. Maybe you participate in a program here or there. These 50 people aren't there necessarily to engage their calling or to become missionary or something, so we would have to deal with that. But this is what I think is true, and I'm going to use this just as maybe a template or an archetype for this, but I actually, in my experience, this is pretty close to true. That in a church of, say, 50 people, you probably would have about 20%. So let's just say these 10 people, who if you gave them this idea, this social technology of microchurches, you gave them the possibility of the ecclesial minimum, of you're called somewhere by God. Do you know what that calling is? To plant the church among those people. About 20%, maybe about 10 of those people would say, I know exactly what you're talking about. And if that's what we're doing now, I can tell you what's in my heart to do. Now, maybe they need a little help, a little coaching, maybe a weekend away to do some calling work, to do some discernment or honing in on that thing because it's dormant or latent or just we haven't engaged or talked about that thing, and so it's a little bit out of reach. Maybe that's what it takes to awaken these 10 called people, and they're mature enough and disciples enough that they would be able to answer that question. And then I would say maybe at the bottom here, you probably have another 20%, another 10 people-ish, about 10 people that are just going to say, I'm just not interested in that. I come here because I want to come to this worship service and I want to sing these songs. And this is the social contract we made. And so please don't deviate from that. And they're not going to be interested in any way engaging. And what that leaves is this group of, say, 20 to 30 people, which I actually think, as they're in a process of maturing and becoming disciples, they might be open to joining their comrades here, to finding one of these 10 ideas that actually is close to their heart. Or maybe it's just their relationship with one of these leaders is tight enough that these people could just dip down into this group of people and say, will you help me? You know, I feel called to parents with kids with disabilities. Would you come along? You know, would you help me plant this new thing? Well, what does that do? Essentially, then you're talking about pulling out these called people, the called out, right? Pulling them out into the world to be apostolic, to do something, to plant the church, to be the church, to plant microchurches. So now, not only do you have 10 missionary initiatives or 10 microchurches coming out of your 50, which you looked at maybe with the lens of scarcity, That's actually pretty incredible, pretty rich. And all of these people then are starting to engage. Some of them are participating, some of them are joining in. Outside the walls of the church, you're seeing things happen. And to each of these communities that they go to, here's the thing you need to understand. Once these people are activated and called out, and once they see that there's little microchurches are happening all over the city or all over your town, then actually there's other people out here, other believers who are called to the same thing. So if I say at-risk kids or something like that, or ex-offenders or whatever, or a neighborhood or something, there are other Christians that will come in immediately into this. So there's a sort of give and take, a growth edge as they go out, as they reach new people that come to faith. They then join this microchurch. There's growth in that sense. But also other Christians that have felt called to that but didn't have a community to join. Suddenly those things grow. And just like that, I'm telling you, just like that, 50 people overnight become this extraordinary network. Just like that. And the growth then that happens is happening out here. Now, you might say, is this a technique or is this a strategy to bring people back into this building? No. No. And that's maybe something we have to make peace with. Is it possible that some of these people that come to faith or that are reached in these microchurches find their way back into the gathering, find their way back into the worship setting? Sure. But if that is the point, if that is the game, I think you've missed it and we've lost the plot. What could it look like for the church in its smallest form here to be incubated, supported, and sent by the church in its current form? This is maybe my little contribution to our thinking about multiplication and growth. The new kind of social technology is not to destroy this or to tear this down, not to try to make it better or revitalize it and make it more of what it once was or bring it back to its former glory, but instead to re-envision what this actually is. The church in its current form, a group of 50 people which maybe struggle with a little bit of an inferiority complex to see themselves as something actually quite extraordinary, the seeds of the kingdom all over your city or your town. And of course, this might actually be modest. It's possible also that some of these people will eventually, over time, as they see their friends and family members chasing that thing that God has put in them, it'll create a kind of holy jealousy. This is what we've seen, where they say, well, I want to know what my calling is. And as people join and participate in these things, they realize that the microchurch is something that's very accessible. It not only activates our calling, but it reawakens the priesthood of all believers. It makes each of us think, oh, I could do that. To see a version of the church which requires hours of preparation and theological education, and it requires, buildings, and it requires staff and all that. That just makes people sit and become spectators because they say, I could never do that. And part of what happens here outside in this missionary ecology is that when people witness this, they go, well, I could do that. That's the church too? I could do that. I started off by talking about, football, and of course what we do is not a game. But in a sense, it's something more than that, something bigger than that. There's a guy called James Carse who wrote a book years ago called Finite and Infinite Games, and essentially he makes the argument that human beings play two kinds of games. One is more like sport. He calls those finite games. They have rules, they have clear competitors. You know what it means to win or to score. You know if you've won or you've lost. It has a beginning and an end, a finite game. And we play those kind of games. But he says we also play what he calls infinite games. Infinite games are different. They have no seeming beginning, and they have no apparent end. The goal of a finite game is to win. The goal of a finite game is to beat your opponent. The goal of a finite game is to see your way towards scoring or winning and getting there at the expense of your opponent. The goal of an infinite game, Carr says, is actually to see something greater happen in the course of your lifetime. An infinite game is not something we ever finish. In fact, to win in an infinite game is to simply keep playing. A writer called Simon Sinek who kind of riffed on Kars's ideas and recently wrote a book called The Infinite Game. Talks about speaking at two conferences in the same year. One was for Microsoft, the other was for Apple. And Sinek says that at the Microsoft conference, he said 80% of the talks he heard, they referenced Apple. They said, "How are we going to beat Apple? How are we going to get a better market share? How are we going to have a better product line than their product line?" and so on. He said he went to the Apple conference and he realized that not one single talk did they ever mention Microsoft. Instead, what he heard was things like, how are we going to get technology into sub-Saharan Africa? How are we going to leverage technology for education? This is the difference, Sinek realized, between playing a finite game and playing an infinite game. And of course, the church, well, we've been given the infinite game. You know, our call is not just to grow churches, or I would even say not even just to make disciples. But our ultimate hope and goal is that the glory of God would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, that he would be worshipped, that all things would be restored to him. And the truth is, in the confrontation of evil, in the making of disciples, in the overcoming of unbelief, in the ushering in of justice or the reign of Christ Jesus in the world, none of those things are something you can really achieve on your own, are they? And so, don't we get ourselves into a little bit of trouble, a little bit of hot water when we think of the church as a finite game, something to be won or lost, as a comparison to another church, to think this church is doing better than that church, instead of seeing actually the thing we're a part of is the ultimate infinite game. It started well before you were here, and it will go on long after you're gone. But instead, it's to take the baton of those that have come before us and to simply do our part as servants, stewards of the kingdom. And I just don't know of a better way to do that, a more embodied way to do that, both in our time and in reflection on the person of Jesus, than to say yes and to empower the people that are under our care to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to be the body of Christ in the world around them. Hope that helps you guys.
That was stunning. And I think you can begin to feel deep down in your bones during a talk like that, that the microchurch way may actually be the way to unleash the priesthood of all believers. Mm-hmm. In other words, microchurch is not the trendy next thing. It's not a program that will attract the masses. It's not a JV form of church that's waiting to get larger someday. It's not just a small group where we're, organizing and putting people into groups to engage content. Microchurch, in our opinion, is the primary expression of God's people. And our one sentence definition of the microchurch is this: it's an extended spiritual family living in everyday gospel community. It's led by ordinary people, and together they are owning the mission of Jesus in a network of relationships. In other words, if you strip away everything that is not essential to being a church, what do you have left? And for us, that would be worship, community, and mission. When Christians begin to work together in sincere worship and genuine community to accomplish the part of God's mission that they are called to in their particular network of relationships, the church is there. Worship, community, and mission, those are the basic elements. Worship is where we are moving from unbelief to belief in Jesus in every area of life. Community is we are activating all the one another commands as our lives grow rooted together in daily gospel community. And mission is we're going to make disciples and we're going to make the kingdom tangible.
That's good.
And when worship, community, and mission are the engine for this extended spiritual family, you have the church. And we call that the ecclesial minimum. And so today, we want you to begin to dream about what is God calling you towards when it comes to the microchurch expression? So we've talked a little bit about the what now.
Yeah.
So let's get into the why.
Yeah. So this next conversation is going to be with Hugh Halter, also OG, right? Hugh's been around a little while. He's we affectionately refer to him as our curmudgeonly uncle.
Hubert
has coached us so much, and also Stacy Gaskins with the Tampa Underground and Tony Peterson. So in this conversation, some of the questions that we've prepped them to answer is like, why are you going after this with your life? What are your commitments to this? What are some of the stories and things that you've been encouraged by? So we hope you enjoy this conversation. I'd encourage you to take out some notes or take out a journal to take some notes, because I guarantee you're going to hear some things from them. They're going to challenge you and encourage you. So we hope you enjoy this little conversation we're going to have with these three. All right, so we're going to jump into a bit of a panel discussion. So we've had some time just to talk about the definitions of microchurch and what we think about those, how we understand them. But we want to take a few minutes just to hear from a couple of different microchurch networks, a little bit of different angles on those. We're going to ask 3 or 4 questions. So before we get into the questions, let's do just some quick introductions. So we've got Hugh Halter, Stacy Gaskins, and Tommy Wilkerson. So I got your name out there. You're welcome to say it again. But let's just get who you are and where you are and what your role is in the network. So let's start with you, Stacy, then we'll go to Tommy and then back up to Hugh.
Yeah, good to be with you guys. I'm down in Tampa, Florida, and with the Underground Network, and I work with the Global Movements team, trying to support leaders who are thinking about microchurch networks and churches that are thinking about pivoting or including microchurch.
Stacy, how long have you been with the Tampa Underground?
I've been with the Underground since the beginning. I was a part of that community that sort of began to dream about whether or not we should do something together in the city.
Cool. Mm-hmm. All right, tell me.
Yeah, so I'm also in Tampa, also part of the Underground. At the time of this conversation, I am listed as one of 2 executive directors of the Underground Network. So I share that role with Lucas Pulley. And yeah, I mean, I would have joined the Underground sometime after Stacy and the team started thinking things up. So my introduction came around 2009, 2010. So yeah.
All right, now for the grandfather of the group, literally the OG of microchurches.
Hugh Halter here in Alton, Illinois, just north of St. Louis. Been doing microchurch as a lifestyle for probably 30, 35 years, but just moved to Alton about 7 years ago. And I've sort of pioneered what's called the Lantern Network. And yeah, still at it. Can't get away from it. Wish I could, but I can't.
All right. So we've already heard a little bit about Tampa. So I'm going to pivot and leave it with you, Hugh, just to share briefly the story of your microchurch network. So you can go back and tell a little bit about previous experiences if you want to go there, but definitely want to hear what's going on in Alton right now.
Yeah, we've started really in Portland, and we went to that model just because our son has such severe epilepsy. We couldn't really leave the house. So we, way back in the 80s, we just thought, well, let's just start doing this out of our neighborhood. So, and there were no books on this thing when we started. I remember then Denver, we did kind of an intentional network, wrote about that in a book called The Tangible Kingdom. And that was, it was about 20 communities around the Denver Metroplex. And then when we moved to Alton, we kind of were being encouraged even by Tampa Underground at that time. We had been given a building and trying to look for ways to bless our city and a fairly impoverished town. So we were looking at kind of a nuance between micro churches in the neighborhoods, right? But also micro business ventures and micro justice work. So we're kind of a connection between all three of those right now in Alton. So it's not just pure, neighborhood work. We do a lot in the city as well, with sort of business development. Anything we can do to bless the city that we're in. So a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Stacy, you're there from the beginning. Give your perspective, and then Tommy, we'll hear your angle on it as well for Tampa.
Yeah, I think, 20 or so years ago, we were doing a lot of campus ministry work in the city. And that's how a lot of the early 50, became friends and knew one another. And we were seeing students discipled and activated into God's mission on campus. And then as they were leaving and entering into our local church expressions, it was just this really big gap. The church didn't quite know how to activate them for mission. And we were seeing them become spectators again. And we personally were just sort of struggling with what we were experiencing in church compared to what we were experiencing in church. We were really sort of struggling with our own sort of disillusionment about what was happening in our churches versus what we were experiencing on campus. So we were sort of praying and trying to discern if we should do something. We didn't really want to, but we were finding leaders like Hugh and his work on Tangible Kingdom and Hirsch's stuff. And those things were helpful to us, and thinking there is maybe a different way. We were learning from the church around the world. And so it sort of set us on this path to start praying and diving into scripture together to figure out, should we start something new in our city? And so it was really born from that place. And it was really a study we did in the book of Revelation, where we sort of felt affirmation from the Lord to do something. We still didn't know what. And it was, a couple more years of us sort of journeying to figure out, what should this thing look like?
So what are you discovering? What does it look like now?
Yeah, we sent some folks to the Philippines to do some learning there, sort of unlearning some of our inherited forms of church and trying to, spend time in scripture and think about like new ways to form church. That's really where we started talking about the language of microchurch, because we were doing simple house church work, very simple, like Wolfgang Simpson. Everything looked the same. We probably had about a dozen at that time. And it was in the Philippines that we started to see images of other ways that church could look, because it could look like a Bible study in the slum that was a worshiping community that also was starting medical co-ops to serve the poor. And that's where we began to sort of dream about small churches that could look like a home church, but they could also look like these other really creative, innovative things. So that's where we started talking about worship, community, mission, that sort of ecclesial minimum of microchurch.
Yeah, so a willingness to bless a lot of creativity as the family of God on mission in a space.
Mm-hmm.
So Tommy, you come in a few years later. What's your experience been with it?
Yeah, I mean, well, at least for me, I really feel like a student of the underground, like, having come in around 2009, 2010, and a lot of my early discipleship being, through a campus ministry, being a part of the underground, and really sort of that being my first experience in a quote unquote church. And so any given Sunday, in our Sunday gatherings, you would have college students, but then you'd also have these vulnerable women who were coming out of the sex industry. You would have men who were, coming out of addiction. You would have these women who were mentoring Black girls in the city, and you'd have all these people who were running house churches in different parts of the city. And it just felt like, oh, wow, we should not be in the same room together. We have no business being together, but Jesus has somehow made us something that we wouldn't be otherwise. And in experiencing that, it ruins you. It ruins you for anything else after, because worship in such a community like that is just so much more vibrant. Like, you sing songs about God, and these truths aren't just theological truths that you believe, but it's things that you've experienced, and you have like tangible witnesses and evidence of that around you in the room. And so, yeah, it's been a beautiful thing that, I don't know, I have just been so fascinated by. And I think in some ways I've committed myself to, experiencing life and Jesus in that particular way. So, yeah.
Well, I think all three of you are hitting right at the edge of this next question. So, Hugh, I'm going to go back to you on this one. And again, I could see it like there was a reality that you had to step into something new and creative, which led to all of these missional communities, as we called them early on, the church being expressed in different forms. Why would you say you've given your life to pursue it, to continue to pursue microchurch as that primary expression of the church?
Yeah, I think it goes all the way back into the 80s. I don't know why, but I just always was very focused on what we now just call evangelism, just people that were outside the church. Growing up in Portland, I think when we planted, there was less than 2% of people under the age of 30 that were in church. So Portland was probably 30 years ahead of a lot of the country. I never met somebody that was a Christian growing up. It was very rare. So for me, I was cutting my teeth, if you will, as a young evangelist with a very clear understanding that nobody was going to be coming to church. We had Grammy Award winners on our little tiny worship team. We had amazing musicians. We would do concerts in parks and there'd be 5,000 people that would show, and we'd hand out flyers and 0 people would come to church. And we knew it ahead of time. We thought, oh, let's just see. And sure enough, so for me, it was always the fact that I just knew that they weren't going to be going to that other thing. And to be honest with you, I never really enjoyed church services, even for myself. I just always felt like, what are we doing to me? So I think that's why I stayed in that zone. We've seen a lot of adults come to faith in our house and in the networks that we started. And now that, I guess the other thing is just I've coached so many leaders from existing church forums that are trying to find like real adults that come to faith. And I just feel like the longer we delay the inevitable, the longer we're not going to see what we've always wanted to see. So I just think it's almost like low-hanging fruit when you get out into the neighborhoods and into the business zones and with real people. They still really like Jesus. They like to talk about spiritual things. So I just think it's fun. That's why, honestly, I wouldn't go back to another form. I really love following Jesus this way. It gives me 90% of my time with people that are outside the church. And for me, it's like saves my soul every day. So I just love it.
All right, let's keep going back around. Stacy, you're next.
Yeah, I think, hearing Hugh say like he just wouldn't go back because he just loves this form of church. I resonate with that because when I read your question to start with, I was like, I don't know if I have dedicated the rest of my life to microchurch. I think it's been more about like trying to follow Jesus and to mission and wanting to see other people do that as well. And part of what we were experiencing in those early years was, the statistics told us and our experience told us that over 80% of people in our cities were never going to step foot in our churches. And just this desire for the people of God to be able to be church in every place among every people in our city. And I think that was really, sort of, I don't know how I ended up in the right place at the right time to be invited into that community. It was nothing I did. I was just there with this group of people, as Brian Sanders started inviting us. But for me, I think that's what it was, just like a longing for every kind of person in our city to have access to Jesus and to see people learn to listen to his voice and obey him. And that has always meant eventually being sent back into his mission, and so I think that's what led me into these smaller forms of church. And I agree. I don't think I could go back, personally.
Yeah. All right. Tell me.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like in some ways, having Stacy and I on the same panel is almost like redundant. Like, I'm just going to say what she says. Being a student of the underground in so many ways, I think the culture of high Christology has a way of, shaping you. So similar to what Stacey was talking about, for me, it doesn't feel like the goal itself necessarily was microchurches as much as it's a love for Jesus and a fascination with him and wanting to be wherever he is. And, part of that is, of course, a commitment to his bride. Like, you can't love Jesus and dislike his bride. It just doesn't work. He has strong feelings about his wife. And so you are committed to the bride, but then you're also committed to his purposes in the world. And part of that is, okay, well, if Jesus is this, well, then how do we understand and look at church and understand church? And you wrestle with Acts, and how does that square with our experience in church as we know it? And just trying to figure out what does this even mean? But kind of like Stacey was talking about, like, in terms of my own passion for it and belief in it, microchurches, it does stem from that experience of being a college student and feeling responsible for reaching the campus and standing shoulder to shoulder with a group of other students and feeling like we are watchmen for this place. And there's a way that we share life together. There's a way that we are pursuing Jesus together. There's a way that we are reaching the campus together that I don't know if we would have called it church, whether because of, rules and protocols of parachurch ministries, but whatever it was, I think we could all agree that it was the realest thing that we'd experienced. And there was something about this that was just like, whatever this is, I want this forever. This is how I'm meeting Jesus. And the more I journey with microchurch leaders and see people, like ordinary people, doing extraordinary things, and hear the testimonies of what they're doing, I just don't think there's any other way for me. It'll always look something like this. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I hear we might phrase it a little differently, but I think we're all saying it's not about the form, but the form is important. So some language that we often use is like, we don't really want to be a microchurch movement. We want to be a disciple-making movement, but we do believe that the form matters in the end. Like, the microchurch probably is the best form that houses that disciple-making movement, because it's there that you can meaningfully engage those one another's. It's in that space that you can actually live life in such a way that, like, the things that we wrestled with in scripture, we can see realized in that way. Sorry, Tommy, I cut you off. You're about to say something.
No, sorry. I didn't realize I was cutting you off. I think, even more than just like a disciple-making movement, it's like, we just want to be a Jesus movement. It's like, and from Jesus, of course, is the call to make disciples and to engage in mission and how all that works itself out. But it's like, you just want to be a Jesus-centered movement, And so, yeah.
Yeah. In that, there's this space of seeing everyday people wake up to what Jesus made them for. Mm-hmm. And I think that was also something that we felt we were missing, as people were watching us live into our giftings and were never really living into the fullness of their own.
Yeah.
And so in these spaces, it's given us freedom to go, like, what do you need? Mm-hmm. Can we help you live into those things?
That was probably the benefit of doing campus ministry, is that we got to see, like, these young 18 to 24-year-olds, like, released to talk about Jesus with their peers and do prayer ministry and study the Bible with their peers and offer people in their classes and on their sports teams in their dorms, like, an opportunity to get to know Jesus and respond to him. And you just realize, like, everyday people can do this. They don't have to be professionals, and that it's part of Jesus' heart, that he calls people to himself, but usually soon after that, he starts calling them to people he loves, and maybe we had the benefit of seeing that with those students to realize, like, oh, I think there are more people in the city that Jesus wants to release into his mission,
Brian, if I can throw in too, even within the microchurch movement, we all talk about APEST as like a new leadership model. And, God gives apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teachers to equip the saints for all the works of ministry. So I just go, the point of leadership in the church is to get everybody involved, obviously. And I just don't think anymore that when we're Sunday centric, that we can break that clergy laity deal. And that, that Ephesians passage talks about the maturing of the body. So I feel like the more we can deprofessionalize the idea of church, the more we mature the church. So I feel like the microchurch movement is a maturing. It's not a dumbing down or making it easier, or, well, we can't do big, so we might as well do small. It's actually a choice to mature and deprofessionalize the movement.
Oh, man, that's rich. So I was going to go there next with this last question. You have written books that many of us have read that have shaped the way that we think about why we should think about church in a smaller form or a more mature form. I'll shift my language now. And Stacy and Tommy, I know so much of the work that Tampa's done has been so inspirational to us from just the ground up there in Tampa. So I'm curious for all of you. You've already answered some of these questions, or answered this question in some ways, but what are the biblical, missional, cultural realities? And we live in different parts of the country, so our answers might be a little different on the cultural component, but we are Westerners in one sense. So what are the realities that have shaped your commitment to the smaller way, to a missionally imaginative way, to equipping everyday people? Hugh, I'll let you go first again.
I'd probably start with cultural. I feel like right now, coming out of COVID and looking at what the evangelical street cred is, I think it's so bad right now that we cannot change their perception of what this is in large groups. I feel like it's like going to a family reunion. There's still, there might be some good family members in there, but you're still afraid that somebody's going to meet Uncle Al, who's going to blow the whole thing apart. So I feel honestly that the culture, the missiological culture, is that when you can trust a few friends with a few of your friends that don't know Jesus, it's about the only way we're going to change the assumptions that they have about who we are and what God is like. So I think that's the cultural moment of why we move small. It's almost like Jesus going, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisee. Like, there's like little nuances that get into the dough that screw up the whole thing. And I feel like we're more able to control the quality of our people, so that people can really run into, the transformative side of what Jesus does. I really fear that even in the next 10 years, our global characteristic of what it means to be an evangelical Christian is going to look so bad and so tainted, and it's going to be tied to so many different things. I almost feel like it's why Jesus came to earth, right? There was so much religion. He had to come and show himself in human form. I think the microchurch movement is going to rehumanize the form so that people can go, I trust Tommy and I trust Brian and their families. Like, I can't imagine people I respect more. And I feel like that's the opportunity within the microchurch movement, is literally change people's idea about what they think God is.
That's good. Stacy?
Yeah, a couple of things that come to mind. One, I think, if we really have a deeply held belief that Jesus is the head of his own church, then, we look at how he's led the church through history. I think the church has been small historically. That, I've heard Brian Sanders talk about this some, that really what we've seen as these large sort of mega versions of church are really the exception in history.
Mm-hmm.
The practical expression of the church across the globe through history has been small. And I was really struck by that comment you made, Hugh, about it being a maturing of the church, that the micro movement is about expanding our vision for what the church can be in the world, not about minimizing it, and that it can be so many things and go to so many places. And I think that's important. And maybe the second thing that was on my mind today is, we were thinking about this conversation, is just like, as we expand our vision for what church can be, there is this like sharing of authority that we see through scripture. And I was just remembering, like, back when we were doing our Revelation Bible study together 15 years ago or whatever, the image in Revelation 4 of the throne room, like there's a throne in the center and there are 24 thrones around it.
Mm.
And the idea that at the end of time, when Jesus is reigning in all of his glory, that he still allows other thrones to be in the throne room with him.
Mhm.
And that the like giving of authority that we see in the Gospels and in Acts is still happening in the revelation of Jesus at the end. And that the microchurch movement, I think, has in it this desire to see us let Jesus share his authority the way he wants to, as he calls people into mission, and that we don't constrict people's ability to say yes and step out and follow Jesus in ways that he never intended for us to like control or to constrain.
That's good. All right, Tommy. She took your high Christology view there. You
What she just said is better than anything we said. I don't even, it's like, sorry, Tommy, like try to think of something now, bro.
Right. Oh man. Yeah, I mean, I guess as I was thinking about it, I guess two things. One, I think about biblically, of course, you look at Acts 2, and that's something that we often come back to, the disciples being in each other's homes, breaking bread, being devoted to the apostles' teaching, the sharing of life with one another and proclaiming the gospel amongst people, sharing what they have. There's a way that they're doing this life on life daily in temple courts, of course, but also in each other's homes. And it's just the implication of being in each other's homes. Like that's something that's intimate. It's small. And the way that, Paul writes letters to the citywide church, but even in addressing the citywide church, there's these little communities that he mentions and highlights and shout outs. And so he talks about this person in the church in their home as he's addressing the church in the city of whatever. And so I think there's lots of precedent there. But I even think, and I'm not like a cultural expert in anything, but it does seem like, as we interact with whether it's people who are on, college campuses or people who are just running maybe more prevailing model churches that have traditionally been successful by our numbers and metrics around that, it seems like there is this distrust towards larger structures. And so they're seeing, maybe it's because, some of the corruption that we've seen and fall of leaders, whether that's, on a government level or even within the church and evangelical circles, it's just like, oh, we associate large with something's wrong with that place. And I don't trust the authority that's in that place. There has to be something wrong there. And so it's almost like in some way, microchurches and these small expressions of the church become these Trojan horses to society, because it's like, oh man, the power of God in these small communities that you're not suspicious of it as much because it doesn't seem as overt or as flashy as whatever mega church down the street or what have you. And so I think that's really interesting to consider, like microchurches as a subversive way of reaching the culture. And kind of what Stacey was talking about, the reality that, churches are the way that we see church and understand church is that 80% of the city still remains unreached. It's like there's no single, if you think phenomenologically or culturally, like there's no single thing for the most part that reaches every person. Like you think about the biggest cultural phenomenons that we've had, and there's still hundreds of millions of people who do not care a single thing about that thing. And so you have to get creative in how you reach those people. And so, I would say those things.
Oh, that's good. All right. So I want to give you each 90 seconds or less on one quick question that I didn't prep you for, but was just coming to mind. So if you all had that moment where you sort of had discontent in your soul and you're like, well, I'm not going this way anymore. I'm going to start going this way. And then I'm going to give my life to it and try to help others do the same. So in 90 seconds or less, predominant model leader, anybody that's like watching this right now, and they're going, I have this discontent in my soul. This is the other word I put, curiosity. But they also have that feeling of like, I don't know. That seems scary. That's beyond what I've done. I don't, like what is your heartbeat for them? What do you want to say to them to encourage them? Any order. If it comes to you right now, just jump in. Otherwise, I'll call your name.
I always feel like, to always think about your own life. Like, how long has it been since you saw the power of God? How long has it been since you were nervous or, like desperately hopeful for God to show up in somebody that you knew? So I always go, way before you think about trying to renovate your church, I always go, don't miss the opportunity to have a whole different set of conversations with your spouse and even your children, your adult children, about just going, hey, what if we re-up with Jesus and see what God would do, and give it like a 12 to 18 month, just like experiment, like, God, like, change my heart, change my mind, freak me out, show me your power. So I go, even if it doesn't work at a whole church level, at least add it to the menu, but start with yourself, and figure out how to clear time so you can literally make, I always tell people it's probably a 10 to 12 hour a week job description to like live intentionally with people. So maybe find the time, and you might even find your heart again, your soul. So start with yourself. Actually, if you do it, it'll mean more to your congregation than any single thing you could possibly do, is if you would actually have stories, even stories of failure, but at least stories.
Yeah, that's good. BC, tell me.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much different to add to that. I was thinking, like, just ask Jesus, is there a place or people that you want me to spend time with this year that are at the edges of the kingdom that don't know you, and just meet someone and try to walk with them. And I think anytime we really get serious again about trying to hear his voice and just be obedient, even in really small things, it can feel like a risk. But I think it takes us back into this place of like mystery with him, and remembering like we actually don't know how to see people's lives transformed. Like, the brokenness and the needs of people in our world are like so far beyond us.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that we can do, no training, no sermon, no pipeline, that is going to transform the human heart. And I think just starting to serve someone gets us in touch again with like, man, Jesus, we need you to come and do something different. So I think just stepping out in that way and not being afraid of the like sort of unknownness of being in that place again.
Yeah. All right, tell me, the last word is yours.
Oh man, no pressure. Two things came to mind. First, I believe it was Alan Hirsch and Michael Frost in The Shaping of Things to Come, where I think Alan Hirsch, they would ask the question to church leaders, like, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? And, after people had listed all the things they wish they could do differently, he kind of would flip it on its head and say, well, then why don't you do that? Do that now. Like, it's not too late to do that. And so I think that that's one thing that comes to mind. But then, just this language of experimentation, I think, has been so helpful and freeing to me, because an experiment, what's going to happen with an experiment? You have no idea. And there's whether it takes off or whether it completely tanks, it's all part of the process. And so to think of it as an experiment, I mean, Stacy has had conversations with me in my own kind of microchurch journey to think of something as an experiment. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think I would just encourage anybody who's kind of on the verge of making some sort of transition or wondering how this all looks to experiment, give it a shot, start small, and see what happens.
Excellent. Well, thank all of you so much for taking some time with us today. If you're hearing for the first time about this book, The Tangible Kingdom, I'd encourage you to go pick that up. You can find more about the Tampa Underground, I think, at tampaunderground.org. If that doesn't work, try .com. Hugh, is there a website right now for what's going on with the Lantern Network?
No, we don't want anybody to find us. Right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Just pray that the Lord would give you some revelation about what is happening in Alden, Illinois. And then you can go.
They can find me at just hughhalter.com. If anything ever does happen, that's
Yeah.
probably
That's fair. Such a rich conversation, and I know it will encourage leaders everywhere. So thank y'all so much.
All right. Peace out.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Oh, man, what a compelling conversation with those three. Hope that you enjoyed that. We're going to do a little break right here. So hit the bathroom, grab something to drink, and we will be back in just a few minutes to start session 2. I hope that you were as inspired by that and maybe as challenged by that as we were. Those are three amazing people that you can tell are giving their life to their cities, but also to help people of God that want to walk into disciple making and see new forms of the church emerge. I learn so much from those three every time I'm with them. So I want to encourage you right now, whatever notes you took from that, whatever is sort of locked in there, maybe you didn't take notes, like what's at the top of your mind right now? What's your biggest why? What's that one thing that the Spirit of God is highlighting for you right now? And I'd encourage you to circle that, jot something down, and think, after the summit's over today, I'm going to do something about that. And begin to invite the Holy Spirit to prompt you in that. Like, what is one thing that you can do to walk in obedience with Jesus because of that conversation? So, Rob, where are we headed next?
Well, so far in this first session, we've talked about what a microchurch is, biblical foundation, why to pursue it. Now in this next session, we're going to focus on disciple making and how that leads to microchurches emerging. One of the things that we say quite often here in Kansas City, when it comes to the Kansas City Underground family, is that we do not plant microchurches. We plant missionaries who plant the gospel, they make disciples, and microchurches emerge. See, when we use the language of church planting, which I'm pro church planting, but when we use that phrase, it's like a piece of luggage. And when you open it up, there's a lot of history and information inside of there.
Yeah.
And when you say church planting, right away, ordinary people think, well, there's a professional communicator. It's about a weekly gathering. There has to be some kind of worship band. They're probably going to have a building. There's going to be children's ministry. And when we say microchurch planting, sometimes people just make the leap and go, oh, so I guess we're doing all of that except in somebody's living room.
Right.
And we go, no. Microchurch is not about a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It's about an extended spiritual family that has emerged from disciple making under the lordship of Jesus, and they're living as a family, an everyday gospel community. And do they have meetings? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. A lot of them. Is the end goal a meeting? Absolutely not. So in this next session, we're going to give you the chance to hear from 3 different microchurch networks on how they're equipping ordinary people in missionary formation, how they're equipping ordinary people to know how to make disciples who can make disciples. It's going to be fantastic. So, Brian, who are we hearing from in this session?
In the next session, we've got, again, just some amazing voices coming in with Bree Wiebe, who works with us in the Kansas City Underground, Myron Pierce, who's in Omaha, and the work that they're doing in the urban core in North Omaha, Dory Ewan, who is at Channel Church in California. And so their approach to disciple making that leads to microchurches. So these are going to be some fantastic stories that you're going to hear from.
Hi, I'm Brianna Wiebe with the Kansas City Underground, and I'm excited to be here with you guys today at the Microchurch Next Summit. So I want to talk to you for a few minutes today about how ordinary people are activated on mission as disciple makers in their everyday lives and their everyday spaces. You see, our mission in Kansas City is to fill this city with the beauty, justice, and good news of Jesus. And we want to see gospel saturation. And for us, that means every man, woman, boy, and girl will have repeated opportunities to see, hear, and experience and respond to the gospel within their network of relationships. And so we know that in order to do that, we're going to need gospel presence. We need to have people on the ground, gospel demonstration, which is showing what God is doing, and gospel proclamation, telling what God is doing. And we knew that in order to help equip our missionaries, we needed to have something for them to be following along on this journey. And so we call that the missionary pathway. Now, this pathway has emerged in movements globally, and it's really been proven to make disciples that make disciples. We've seen that abroad, and we've seen that in Kansas City, and it's very exciting. So this pathway is used to mobilize those ordinary, everyday people into mission as disciple makers in their everyday lives and their everyday places and spaces. So what I want to do today is just walk through the 5 phases with you guys briefly. And that first phase is extraordinary prayer and fasting. And so we oftentimes will say, well, what does extraordinary mean? Well, you take what's ordinary and you add one extra thing, then you have extraordinary. So think about what your prayer life looks like now, add one thing to it. And that's going to make it extraordinary. Just keep pressing into that. And fasting as well. This is a discipline that is so very important to be able to set aside time and really focus and hear from God. So extraordinary prayer and fasting, and never leave this phase. Let me say it again. We should never leave this phase. There's 2 types of prayer that we oftentimes will see here, and that's listening prayer and then mission or strategic prayer. So that listening prayer is where we will say to God, God, where are you at work? And then we listen. We don't go out and try to make something happen or manufacture it or go where we think it's going to be the best. We say, God, where are you at work? We let him inform our steps. That's the listening prayer. The missional or strategic prayer is another question. And that's, God, how can I join you? How can I join you where you're already at work? And then we listen, and then we go. And what you'll start to see in this is God will start to highlight faces and names and people and places. And it's going to be so exciting because you'll start to see those highlights and you'll go, that's where God wants me. And you'll know that through extraordinary prayer and fasting. So the second phase is live as missionaries. So once God has really started to highlight these things for us, these places and people groups, we want to go live as a missionary there in that place. And this is not going to probably be a brand new place that you've never been. It's going to be a place you're already existing, a place that you have a reason to exist for one reason or another. And that's maybe where you live, where you work, where you learn, where you play. I might add where you shop, where you work out at the gym, where your kids hang out, the park down the street, the movie theater. Get creative here. Think about your life and think, man, where am I existing already? That's probably where God has for you to live as a missionary. And we want to bless people there. I'm going to run through this acronym real quickly. Bless. So B is begin in prayer. We've already hit that one. L is listen. Want to be listening to Jesus and listening to the people around us and listening to the context and what we are seeing going on there. E is eat. That's a great one. Something about eating breaks down walls between people. S is serve and be served. So we want to serve people and let them serve us. And story is sharing our story and the story of Jesus and how he informs our lives. So we want to bless people as we are being a missionary and living as a missionary there, looking for people of peace all around us who are open to us, open to the gospel, and they can also open doors that we can't open because we don't have a reason to exist there, but they do. We just want to be good news to the people to whom God has called us. So that's living as a missionary. The third phase is plant the gospel. Planting the gospel, I want you to recognize here that I did not say plant a church. We want to plant the gospel. When you start to see these spiritual conversations are leading to more, and that's exciting time, you guys, because we start to see people leaning in and they're asking questions and they're going a little bit deeper. And these questions are moving from casual to meaningful to spiritual. We want to have tools ready so that we can plant the gospel and we can tell them, this is why I believe what I believe. That's what the Bible says, be ready to share why you believe. And so there's a million tools out there. I know you guys probably know more than I do. The one for the underground that I wanted to mention today in Kansas City, we've seen be very effective is Discovery Bible Study, or DBS. So DBS levels the playing field for all who are involved and for all who want to facilitate or can facilitate. And we believe everyone can. This is the beginning of starting to give people that permission and letting them know you can go do this. You don't need me. You can do a DBS with the people that you are around, right? So that's planting the gospel. Number 4 is the church emerges. So again, I want you to catch that. We plant the gospel so we can see the church emerge. And oftentimes we see this church start to emerge out of new disciples. We see these new disciples starting to journey with Jesus and they're getting excited and we want to release them, right? Release them to go. That's the whole point, that they don't have to be paid professionals. They don't have to have a seminary degree. They don't have to go to this school or attend this class. They can go tell people about Jesus, and we need to release them to do so. We start to see this church emerging out of these new disciples. And then I want to talk to you about how we define church, all right? Oftentimes, we hear church defined as an activity, a place to go, a thing you do, an activity or an event. We don't want to define church as activity. We want to define church as identity. And for the Kansas City Underground, the church is defined as extended spiritual family. We want to run everything through the lens of family, and that's a biblical lens that we're running that through. So when you hear us talking about church in Kansas City, we are talking about extended spiritual family. And then we say, well, how do you know when this extended spiritual family that's starting to come together is actually a church, the church microchurch, you know? And so what we say is there are 3 core pillars. For us, we see worship, community, and mission. And when we start to see those 3 things start to collide, it gets messy and crazy and beautiful all at the same time, because that's the church. You're worshiping together, you're on mission together to that pocket of people or to that place that God's called you, and your community. You're seeing the community happen, and it's a beautiful thing. So that's what we see when we see the church emerge. Lastly, I want to talk to you about the fifth phase, which is multiplication. All right, so here's what we usually see. We usually see people start to pray extraordinarily and fast. We see them live as missionaries. We see them plant the gospel. We see the church emerge, and then it stops because multiplication is oftentimes not talked about. And if we stop here, if we stop when the church emerges and we just get comfortable and happy because we love our people and we don't like change, and so we just want to stay how we are and stay super comfortable, we will never see that viral movement. We'll never see disciples that make disciples that make disciples. So multiplication needs to be baked in from the start, that idea. And it needs to be at every level. We want to see new leaders and new DBSs and new groups and new gatherings and new teams, and all of these new things start to bubble up. And that's how KC Underground defines multiplication. It's less of dividing and splitting and separating what's already there. It is sending out new things from what's already there. So we want to see these new leaders and these new groups start to spread out. And then they come back together as a family and they can talk about what God is doing, but they're still going out. So that's the multiplication that we see, and the disciples making disciples. So I want to end with this. If we want to see disciples made, we kind of have to work backwards a little bit, right? So you can't see multiplication if nothing is emerging. You can't see anything emerging if you're not planting the gospel. You can't plant the gospel if you don't know where God is calling you. And you can't know where God is calling you if you don't ask him. So as you can see, for us, these 5 phases of the missionary pathway are so intertwined, and they work together in such a beautiful way to see disciples make disciples make disciples. I hope that this has been beneficial for you. God bless.
Welcome to the Microchurch Summit. My name is Myron Pierce. I am from Omaha, Nebraska, and I get to lead a fabulous expression of the kingdom called Mission Church. Our number one dream at Mission Church is simply to saturate every inner city with diverse, hope-filled, missionaries and microchurches. And so today I want to talk to you about the process of disciple making. Did you know that disciple making is a process? And when we talk about process, I'm mindful of Facebook's study that they've done recently within the last couple months about the effects of COVID and the condition of their fan base, which includes me and you, most likely, if we're frequenting anything called WhatsApp or Instagram or Facebook, right? But what they discover is that through the pandemic, our circles got smaller. So quantity diminished, quality increased. So although our circles got smaller, the quality of friendships that we've been able to cultivate got better. And it got me thinking about the process of disciple making. That disciple making is really about the quality of the friendship and the relationship, and then how it moves us towards Jesus and moves us towards making disciples. And in this process, I've learned the starting point for this process is having a clear definition of disciple. And maybe you have a clear definition of disciple and you've been hammering away with it, at it with your people, and maybe they're tired of hearing it, but definition matters. And the process of arriving at a definition of disciple maker matters for a few reasons. It gives us the synergy that we need to be all on the same page. I was doing a training one time, and I asked the people, I said, hey, out of 25 of you in the room, what's your definition of disciple? And all the hands go up, and now we have 25 different definitions. Imagine in your micro expression of the kingdom that every single person had a different definition of disciple making. The reason why that puts us at a disadvantage is because it doesn't create the harmony that you need to get, and that I need to get the job done when it comes to creating and stewarding disciple making movements. So the process of or the journey of this type of process when it comes to disciple making, I believe begins with, at least that's the journey we've been on as a church, that we started with asking this number one question: what does the scripture reveal about disciple making? Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, from the front to the back. And as we journeyed together to conclude what we felt like the scriptures were saying to us in our context, we landed on this one word, and it's the word hope. We got to looking around and we got to saying, wow, is disciple making, is it really about being a hope dealer? And the reason why that matters for us is context and language. I personally was facing 200 years in the penitentiary. I had a radical encounter with Jesus, ended up going to prison with a 16 to 33-year sentence. And while I spent all of those years behind the prison walls, it was clear as I was reading scripture that God was asking us to do more than just have church. He was asking us to actually make disciples. And so when we think about this journey of discovery when it comes to theology, we landed on hope. And the reason why I say that matters is when you land on an agreed upon definition that the scripture reveals, it increases your impact rate. It increases the amount of people who can come to know Jesus. And it all of a sudden gives us something to aim for. If your definition of disciple within your expression of the kingdom isn't agreed upon, then it's hard to move forward. Secondly, after we said, hey man, to be a hope dealer really speaks to the heart of disciple making. But philosophically, what does that mean? And to be able to banter back and forth around the implications of that definition of theology is just a practice of maturity. And then after we've had enough conversation, then moving to, okay, what method of disciple making, right? How do we see in the context of our community, our culture, the values, do we see ourselves leaning into disciple making and then finally landing on experience? I think those four points matter, because when I talk about experience, what I mean is we are shaped by the people that we spend our time by, whether we like it or not. And to intentionally know and understand that if I have a definition for disciple, it puts me on the same page with the people that I'm locking arms with, right? And if I can arrive on that first step within the process, then I can move to the next step, which is description. So if we defined it, then how would you describe? How would you articulate disciple? How would you describe it? And all of a sudden we went through this process of saying, well, I think being a hope dealer really is about leading people into a hope-filled life in Christ. And we arrived at that again by revisiting the scriptures and saying, God, when we look at the life of Jesus, how would we describe it? Well, we would say that Jesus is the ultimate hope dealer, and his sole responsibility was to lead people into hope, to a hope-filled life, because the hope-filled life is the kingdom life. And the kingdom life is unprecedented, right? And then thirdly, when we talk about process, the dimensions of disciple making, we have to be clear on. And so what we did is we said, well, let's create a tool that helps people think through these dimensions. There are only 5. We call it the hope method. But number 1 is hope. And the question we're asking anyone I'm in relationship with is, yo, man, over the last 7 days, how did you deal hope? Today I had a number of meetings, and we lead an entrepreneurial. We lead tons of entrepreneurial efforts here in our city, which has been a springboard and a billboard for the gospel. But sitting down with a young lady today, and for her to say, I feel so clear, right? Only hope can get us to a place of clarity. Only hope can get us to a place of clarity. And so holding ourselves accountable to the question of hope, how did you deal hope over this last week, assumes the position of hey, here's what it means to be a disciple. That this dimension, this domain of disciple making isn't just about information. It's about the way that I live, move and breathe in culture, and how I'm rubbing shoulders with people outside of the times we gather as a church family. The second question is the head question. And when we're spending intentional time together in God's word, we'll go through a passage and then we'll simply ask this question: how would you summarize the scripture that you just read in 2 words? And what we're aiming at is helping people have a clear biblical understanding of what they're reading. That matters. The next question is the heart question. And it's a beautiful one, because we're simply asking, hey, like, what's God saying to you about this particular passage? What is he revealing to you? What is he speaking to your heart? And then allowing everybody to have input on what they hear God saying. This is beautiful, because a couple of years ago I was discipling this guy, and I asked him the question, like, what do you feel like God's saying to you? And he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what do you mean? What is God saying to me? And it was like one of them aha moments that, like, God can speak to us, and he wants to speak to us. That question matters. The fourth question is a hands question. It's simply, okay, within the next 36 hours, like, what is God asking you to do? That speaks to the Matthew 28 mandate to teach them to obey. And then concluding that with, hey, how can we help? How can we pray? We call this the hope method. And we figured out that these different dimensions really go back to the 5-fold. When we talk about hope, head, heart, hands, and help, apostle, prophet, pastor, teacher, evangelist is written all over that. And so what we're giving and offering and concluding is that a holistic picture of these different dimensions to disciple making matters. And the beautiful thing about the hope method is you can use it as an apprenticing platform as well. So as you meet with people and as you disciple them, using the 5 questions to the hope method to ask people to measure where they're at on a scale from 1 to 5 gives us a starting point for helping them create a plan to move from where they are on that scale to the next step. And then all of a sudden, if we can move people across the scale, then all of a sudden they see that they're not just called to make disciples, but they're called to make disciples that make disciples. This process of disciple making, starting with definition, moving to description, and then working through the dimensions of disciple making, right? Hope, head, heart, hands, help, has created generations of new expressions of the kingdom in our city and certainly around the country. Hey, that's all I have for you today. I am so thankful that I get to be a part of this. I'm so thankful for Leadership Network giving me the opportunity to spend a couple minutes with you. Hey, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can reach me at myron@thisismission.org. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you right now for our time. It went by so quick. But my prayer is that we'd respond like David when he said, this one thing I do, or the Apostle Paul, this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind me. That principle there of the one thing, I would ask that it be applied to this session, where my brothers and sisters can simply walk away saying, what's the one thing? And how do I work that? In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dory, and I'm a disciple maker. It all started out with just simply hearing God's voice and then doing what he says. About 4 years ago, after receiving a week-long intensive disciple-making training, I was quite overwhelmed. I know what I've done in the past was everything but disciple-making. The Lord told me, Dory, you've been trying to grow ministries, you've been trying to grow programs, and even growing a great team. But have you ever tried growing people? I'm like, oh, darn it. I've never tried doing that, Lord. How do you even grow people? I've never done that before. How do I even begin? So I called all my leaders to come back to the drawing board to rethink our focus and our mission. So we conclude that our vision would be till all nations worship. Our goal is to see all tribes and all nations bow down to worship our Lord. And how do we achieve this goal? We decided to do the following. Number 1, intentional disciple making. We spend time with people and do everything with them with the intention to help them to grow, to feed themselves, and to be able to continue to teach others. Number 2, missional living. To reach all nations, we need to mobilize ordinary people to live out their missional call in their homes, in their marketplace, and to be the light wherever they are. People need to know that they're called as the everyday missionary whose mission field is their family, or maybe their neighborhood groceries or gym, or their office. Number 3, gathering and scattering. We gather as the body to worship, to learn, to train, and to encourage one another. And at the same time, we have to scatter with a mission to penetrate our respective communities simultaneously. And number 4, if we do all the 3 things above, we will be able to achieve the 4th thing, which is healthy multiplication. Cool. So I have my refined vision and mission. Now, who and where do I begin? I figured that I'll start small and maybe I just have to start somewhere. So I invited 8 people in the group who are willing to learn and begin my first disciple-making group at the end of 2018. And that group failed miserably. And the second group began in 2019. And out of the 7 people in the group, 2 decided to start churches in their homes. Amber was one of them. She began to train her friends to do the same thing I've taught her. She reached out to Michael, who lives 20 miles away from her. Michael decided to start a church as well, in his own home. He also began to train his friends to do the same thing Amber taught him. One day, while Michael was prayer walking his neighborhood, he met Troy, who was a tea house owner. Troy accepted Jesus, got baptized. They started prayer walking together, and they met Kathleen, who works across the street from Troy. Kathleen was an addict and was homeless for a while, but Jesus turned her life around. And when she's meaningfully connected with Jesus' disciple in her neighborhood, she found her mission and her vision for the kingdom. And she began to return to the shelter she used to stay and start reaching the people for Jesus. So, how do we train ordinary people to be missionaries and disciple makers in everyday space? First, we need to use simple, repeatable methods. To train disciple makers, and not just disciples, we need to use the simplest and the repeatable tools with the idea to train teachers, not students. Simple things grow and simple things multiply. If you want to multiply, you have to make things stick. Tools like 3/3 gathering format, devotional tools like soaps, per walking, per wheel, and sharing my story and God's story. All of these are some of the simple tools that we use to train others. It is easy and reproducible. So much so that both kids and senior citizens are able to use them to share with others. Simple tools and methods help people to obey and experience life transformation. The tools itself do not guarantee multiplication, because multiplication is solely the work of the Holy Spirit. But without simple and reproducible tools, it will be harder for ordinary people to repeat and to train others. Tools are like eating utensils. The fork, the spoon, and the knife are meant to be simple and functional. You can be all creative with your food and how you make them, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel to come up with the utensils to eat. Second, focus on self-directed learning. In order for individuals to be mature and independent, We can't just provide the necessary nutrients for them to grow. But more importantly, we need to help them to be able to feed themselves so that they can sustain, they can grow, and they can feed others as well. Feeding people without training them to feed themselves create unhealthy dependencies. We cannot just teach the word. We need to help individuals to build a habit, a lifestyle, and to have the confidence to seek God through the word, through prayer, and through their own life experience. People need to learn to hear from God themselves. And our role as disciple makers is not to give answers. We're there to empower people to hear from God. We need to strengthen disciple makers by helping them to focus on feeding themselves in these 5 areas: word, prayer, body life, sharing, and hard times. These 5 areas help individuals to be more familiar with God's voice. For all these areas, we have simple tools to help them to learn in a self-directed way. Third, disciple making must be obedience-based. Jesus said, "If you love me, obey my commands." Obedience and love are the 2 sides of the same coin. Some say if we know who we are in Christ, then we would be able to have this love flow naturally, and we don't even need to emphasize obedience. Well, but our identity and our life transformation is a process. It's a journey, not a destiny. One can't completely understand the love of Christ and then respond. It is through obedience that we're able to grow in the understanding of His love and our love for Him. It is experiential learning through individuals' acts of obedience. Well, that said, what have I learned about training disciple makers in the past few years? Well, a lot. First, pour deeply into a few. Focus on deepening relationships with one another. Relational before organizational. You only have time to train a few at a time. So you have to resist the desire to gather big crowds as much as possible. Resist personality-driven leadership. I'd rather spend time modeling prayer and going out to prayer walk and maybe spend time with individuals who are willing to obey than to talk to a big crowd for an hour. Second, modeling. Take them out and show them how. I model gospel sharing, and I model how to pray, and I also model vulnerability, admitting weaknesses, confession, and even self-awareness. We need to model skills as well as character building. Third, after modeling, then we assist and we watch them, and last and the most important step is to leave. Release. It is empowering leadership. Just get out of the way, shut up, and leave, especially when you have a big personality. People get intimidated when you're always around trying to give the last word. Fourth, filtering by obedience. This is how Jesus selected his disciples. They need to choose to follow and make a choice. Focus on the one who obey and don't look at their skills or potentials, because many people actually are pretty skillful, but they're disobedient. When you encounter people who are distracted or maybe not quite ready to listen, don't waste time. Leave them alone and move on, because you can't change their hearts. Only God can. Sometimes God uses isolation and hardships to help change people's hearts. Fifth, stop counting generations and numbers. It is going to go slow before it goes fast anyway. Change the way you measure success. If you want to brag about something, why don't you brag about life-changing stories, brag about people's transformation, and maybe their commitment to obey? 6, balance the outward growth with the inward growth. Learning to hear from God and building intimacy with Him is just as important as gospel sharing. If you focus on one thing and not another, the growth won't last and it's not complete. And last but not least, number 7, people must own the vision of God. You can cast vision all you want, and the people will follow you and they'll be super on fire. But they would only buy into your vision as long as you can drag them along. The only way to help individuals to live out their missional call is to help them to find God's vision for themselves. I'm Dory, and I'm a disciple maker. I'll see you next time.
Another great session. We got 3 different angles on how to train ordinary people as disciple makers. I'm sure right now your head is full of faces of people that you care about, that you want to get behind to equip as disciple makers. But it's time for a break. So you've got 5 minutes. Go get a cup of coffee. Go stretch your legs. Nature is calling. Go enjoy your break. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
right, welcome back to session 3. So we know we've had a ton of information coming at you. You can tell Rob is all excited about session 3 because we're going to make a turn now towards transitions and implementation. So Rob, tell us what we mean by transitions and implementation.
There's 2 ways to begin. One is from within the predominant model, like yeast in the dough. We're going to hear from Dave Ferguson. You ever heard of that guy? Rodrigo Cano, who's actually the guy who's implementing it at Community Christian Church. Amazing story there. And then Joel Repick, who's with the Greenhouse Network, and they have worked in collaboration with legacy churches to birth new wineskin and micro communities and micro enterprises. It's both amazing stories of working, starting with the legacy model, launching something new. And then we're going to get with Peyton Jones, who's a force of nature. Church Plantology. If you haven't bought it, go buy it. Best book on church planting out there. And he's going to tell a story of a new work that's starting in the streets of San Diego. And it's going to be very compelling. So starting from within the traditional or predominant model or starting fresh, that's what we're going to get into in this session.
Hey, my name is Rodrigo Cano, and I'm here with Dave Ferguson, the lead pastor of Community Christian Church. And we're going to be talking about micro churches within the predominant model of churches. And so, Dave, give us a quick intro of who you are, what you do.
I have a few different hats. I am the interim CEO at Exponential, one of the founders, and also visionary for New Thing. But the hat I'm wearing today is lead pastor at Community Christian Church in Chicago.
Awesome. And I serve as the community pastor in one of our locations, the Aurora location, but I also get the privilege to lead our effort to start micro churches within Community Christian Church. And so, as most churches, there's a pre-COVID and after COVID reality of churches. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the big changes for us is, pre-COVID, we would describe our church as one church with multiple locations.
Yeah.
Post-COVID, we really made a couple different important shifts. We said, now we're one church with multiple expressions and really 4 expressions.
Yep.
And those 4 expressions are, we have community locations in the city and suburbs of Chicago, and like you lead one in Aurora.
Yep.
Then we also have community freedom, which are our locations that we're starting in prisons, and we have 3 of those now.
Yep.
And then we also have community online, which is our digital expression. And then the 4th expression is what we're going to talk about today, is our micro churches. And we're pretty pumped. And I have to say too, Rodrigo's doing a great job of us really getting that off the ground.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And so, there's been a change in basically like who we are as a church and what it means and how we invest in leaders and all of these things. And so for us, when we talk about micro churches, they're a full but smaller expression of Community Christian Church. That's the way we define them. Wherever you work, you play, or you live. And basically what we've done is identify leaders, people who are passionate about these, people who are already sitting in our chairs and they were passionate about it, and then engage them through training. And so then we identify and we train them, we equip them, and then we empower them to do what God is calling them to do.
Right.
And it's amazing because not only here locally, but God has opened a lot of different doors international. And the things that God is doing through these micro expressions of the church, it has been really great. So I don't know if there's one story that comes to mind as you think about this.
And I'd say to Rodrigo's credit, we like to kind of move pretty fast and scale things, but we have started kind of small. But even and part of that is starting small, is trying to get it right and try to approach it with some humility. Like, hey, we're not great at this yet.
Yeah.
But I have to say, some great things are starting to happen, and I think surprised both of us.
Yeah.
Okay. One story. For example, and you can tell some of the other stories, and you may have to help me out with this one. We had one guy who actually attends community online. One of our digital expressions is a guy named Kali from India. So when you're online, we have people really all over the country and around the world that join us. And so he joined us from India, was participating in community online. And when we started doing the micro church training, he just asked, hey, can I go through the training?
Yeah.
And since you're doing, some of the stuff you do in person, but you make it available all online, we're like, yeah, jump in. We'd love to have you do it. So he does it, and he launches a 3C community in India.
Yeah.
And I mean, he has about 30 folks there. He's sending you pictures, you're coaching him. It's like the real deal. It's happening.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is kind of like, hey, can I bring a couple more people?
Yeah.
And pretty soon, I mean, we're like 6 months into this experiment, and we got 3C communities, 3 micro churches in India. And I think the next part of that was he said, hey, could I use the training to train other people?
Train other people, yep.
And so now we're like a year into this, and we have 15 micro churches in India. And just like this last week, I mean, he's sending us pictures. Hey, here's, what was it, 26 more people
He just baptized 26
that he baptized.
people,
And then he's also telling us, yeah, I got 10 more people that want to go through the training to start micro churches.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. Here's what's happening is what it looks like by Christmas, we could have, I mean, we'll be north of probably 35 micro churches, but 25 of them could be in India with 30 people each. That's like 750 people. And I was telling Rodrigo, I'm going like 750 people, that would be like our third largest location.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, and we feel like we're just getting started.
Yeah.
Okay, there's other things happening though. So that's one of my favorite stories because I think it's a cool, interesting blend between both the micro and the meta. Both those things. But there's some other things that are happening that, I mean, are equally inspiring.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll share this story about Rick Bowley. So Rick Bowley has this passion to start something for families with special needs. And
kids with special needs.
Kids with special needs, yes. And so we have been talking about it, and it's trying to start, a service, a micro church for them. And we've been talking, do we do it here at what we call the Yellow Box, which is one of the biggest locations, or do we do it in Aurora? We've been having these conversations and we're praying about it. And out of the blue, all of a sudden, I received an email from an organization in Aurora saying, hey, we have residents who have special needs, and we're looking for the church component to this. Would you be open to do something for us?
Basically asking you, will you start a church?
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just, I mean, we know it was God. It has God all over it. But me and Rick went there. We met with the director. She told us her vision. We shared our vision for what we want to do. And said, okay, yeah, we want to do it. And so we're incubating a micro church within something that we call Tuesday Nights a Community in Aurora, where the residents are going to come and they're going to, engage with other people. We're going to eat together, but then we're going to start the micro specifically for them, kind of like an incubator for when we have something bigger for special needs residents. So,
and I think one of the things that you've helped me really see is that what's unique about the micro churches that are different than in our small groups is, I mean, they are started specifically out of mission.
Yes.
So like you said, Rick. So Rick is starting a micro church to reach families who have kids who have special needs. Name some of the others that are, I mean, Cole, who started in India. I mean,
in India,
he's baptized how many people so far this year?
Like 66 people.
So I mean, there's a clear evangelistic mission that he's a part of. There's some others that we got.
Yeah, we have Andy and Kelsey who are doing for disengaged millennials, millennials that would not come to a regular church for a lot of reasons. We have Umar and Ana who are doing one in Spanish and one in English for second generation Hispanics who would still identify, as Hispanic, but English is their first language. And so, I mean, they're doing a lot of awesome work that God is doing there. And we are in the process of starting another micro and assisted living. So I mean, God is opening so many doors. And so, I like what you said though. Like we're going slow, or we're still going slow because we're still trying to figure it out, but we dare to take some steps. So, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what would you say to a church that is thinking about this? What do you advise be for them?
Well, I mean, two things come to mind, and I've been telling people, I think you can almost kind of take a look at church and put them in three categories. There's micro, and then there's macro, which I'd say is the prevailing model. And then there's also meta. And if church planting or churches were like a stock portfolio, I mean, I'm telling you, I would invest in meta, but I'd really invest in micro. And so for all of you that are leading a church or have just recently planted a church, I would say, try to do this. Just start experimenting. Rodrigo may hit me for this, but like how much money have we actually invested in this?
Almost nothing. I mean, we have invested in training.
Now he's not
obviously.
happy about this.
Yeah, I'm not happy about that, but almost nothing. It's more like the training and the time, and
it's been a lot of it, your time and some
Yeah.
other people you brought around you and the
Yeah.
training. And we need to invest. And I keep telling them, hey, we're going to figure this out. But I'm telling you, you can get started. And again, start small with humility, going, we don't know how to do this, but and also, I mean, if people want more information about how we're doing it,
yeah, they can reach out to me.
What's your email?
Rodrigo Cano at Community Christian Church.
Rodrigo Cano at communitychristian.org.
Yeah.
Send them an email. We would open up our training to some of you all if you'd like to be a part of that.
Yep.
But however we can help.
Yep. Yeah. And so, I mean, there's so much that we can say about this. I am passionate about it. I know you're passionate about it, but they only gave us 10 minutes. So
I know. Come on,
give us more time.
That's right.
But no, I mean, once again, if you have any questions, reach out to us. We will be more than happy to share with you any details that you need. And
I think we had a link too on our website. So it's like communitychristian.org/3C.
3C. Yeah.
communitychristian.org/3C.
Yeah.
All right.
You can find more information there. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Hello, my name is Joel Repick, and just for a few moments, I'm going to share with you some about microchurches and microchurch networks emerging from within predominant model contexts. To do that, I'm going to share with you a little bit of our story. So our network, the Greenhouse Network, emerged from a former steel town in the Ohio River Valley, a place that had experienced a lot of disinvestment, difficulty in our history as the steel industry vacated our river towns, a place that for the people who were left was deeply rooted in tradition and history. And I mention that because that context of honoring our past and even honoring the institutions that were present in our community, whether they're churches, schools, or other kinds of associations, is a big deal for the people in our context. And in some ways, that probably shaped the way that our network was formed, this sense of honoring even some of the institutions that were present in the place where our network was taking shape and growing. So almost 20 years ago, I was invited to become the youth pastor at the church actually I grew up in, but it was a church in this community that had a 100+ year history. Also a church that was experiencing decline, that had been through some difficult times. And although I had been hired to be the youth pastor, there really weren't any teenagers in the church. So my wife and I started to reach kids in the community. And as part of reaching kids in our neighborhood, we started a youth development organization that was separate from the church, a separate nonprofit organization that began to gather college students to reach young people in our community. There was a movement of prayer that happened among those college students. And over time, some of those college students began to relocate to our community and start things. And so in time, a small family emerged of nonprofit organizations, businesses as mission, house churches. And we started to see people from our own context start things as well. It was very organic at the time. I don't think we had set out to start a network, but in time, we realized that a network had formed. Eventually, we started an incubator accelerator organization that served as a service platform to those emerging microchurches, and we saw our network begin to emerge in other neighborhoods in the Pittsburgh region. But we look back in our story at the very beginning when there was this original youth development organization and this legacy church existing in proximity to each other. Very different, kinds of expressions. There was this legacy church with all of this history, all of, this really traditional structure. And then there was this new thing happening that was trying to reach kids that maybe had been overlooked. And connected to that was a new fervency in prayer and fasting. It felt like Jesus was doing something new among us. Now, we wouldn't have had language for it at the time, but we look back at that essential building block of these two systems existing next to each other, a predominant model legacy system and a microchurch expression, even if we wouldn't have had that language at the time. And we have seen how this relationship, this dual operating way of thinking or experiencing movement in our region has continued to play out. As a matter of fact, because that legacy church was part of our original experience, it's remained for us just a value, a precious part of our story, to keep extending invitation to legacy churches in our region, and to keep trying to understand how those legacy churches can play a role in proximity and relationship with micro churches that are emerging in the region as well. I want to say just a few things about dual operating systems and some of what we learned by these two very different systems existing beside each other. First of all, I think the dual operating system concept is really important, because we really want legacy, expressions to participate in what's happening in microchurch movement. At the same time, it's also important that when these systems begin to behave badly, that there are protections from sabotage happening between the systems. And sabotage sometimes happens in really unintentional ways. Sometimes it's just people don't have the paradigms to be able to see new things, or they haven't fully been able to examine their own ecclesiology or theological assumptions as it relates to the church. And so for us, it was really good to have these two different systems, so that the microchurch system could grow and expand and innovate, and the legacy system could participate in that story, but also not sabotage that story. However, one thing we learned is that these two systems staying next to each other does cultivate or encourage a kind of humility between the systems and in the leaders that exist in these systems. And it's because in their own ways, both of these systems have their own temptations towards acting and behaving badly as movement begins to grow. So for instance, as our network began to emerge and we were seeing these new expressions and new fervency in prayer, I think there was a temptation among some of our leaders to really write off completely some of the legacy expressions. Now, as Western Pennsylvanians, I think there was some kind of check in us, because that rubs us wrong. It doesn't feel good, I think, to us to not pay attention to the institutions in our community that have had history and so on and so forth. But there was this temptation, to think that we had something better and more innovative, so just to leave all that stuff behind. On the other side, I was still on staff at this historic church. I think institutions like that do have temptations towards control, or to begin to act out of fear, or to become jealous of the new innovative thing. And there's a lot that we learned about existing in that space, and the kind of humility that's really required from leaders to be able to navigate that space, to be able to lead people towards patience with the other system, towards mutual submission. But as we look back, we see that journey really had a sanctifying effect on us, even on our microchurch network. And we're really grateful for that and the way that it shaped leadership among us. I also want to say this about those predominant models and microchurch networks emerging nearby those predominant models. I think one thing we discovered is that in some ways it really allowed that predominant model church, that legacy church, to own what it was and what it wasn't, and kind of to let it off the hook in some ways. I think sometimes even our legacy churches feel all this pressure to be something innovative and new that they just aren't. I mean, the journey can be so difficult. I remember at one point meeting with the leaders of this legacy church and saying, you know what, you actually don't need to be that, because you're in relationship with this microchurch network where all these leaders are starting new things, and you're seeing these new simple expressions of the gospel emerge in communities. So you can actually take a deep breath and just be what you are. And the beautiful thing about that was it really allowed that church, the original church in our story, to become a service platform for the network. So although we started a new service platform, this legacy church also became a service platform and was able to serve microchurch leaders, didn't have to innovate everything in-house, didn't have to start new things in-house, but could just ask the question, how do we serve what God is doing in our region? And that is probably the thing that is most precious to me at this point and what we're seeing in our network. We're creating new spaces where legacy church and microchurch leaders can be in relationship with each other, in many ways just bless what the other one is and what the other one isn't. And where legacy churches, even small legacy churches, maybe that are struggling, can bring what they have to the table and learn to be a service platform to microchurches. And what we've discovered is when legacy churches take that posture, very often, it's not guaranteed, but very often they experience a kind of renewal themselves because they get to be part of a wider story of what God is doing in the region. And that feels good to us to see God work in both of these spaces.
In Acts chapter 5, verse 42, we're told that the church continued to meet house to house and in temple courts. So if we're going to talk about starting a church, microchurch network in the streets, it's really a matter of finding out what our public space component is. That's what you see, house to house, microchurch, we understand that, but the public space is equally as powerful. In fact, it could even be more powerful. Here's why. When you go to the Gospels, if you really look at it, most of Jesus's ministry was done outside or in public venues, public scenarios. Very little of it was actually done in homes, although we do have a few places. It's the same pattern, but the majority is in public space. Then if you go to the book of Acts, you see that the Apostle Paul also is entering the rhythms of the community. And that's the first thing about starting microchurch. Often when you think about microchurch, you think, well, I'm starting something. But the reality is, if you're going to practice microchurch effectively in public space, it's better to enter the rhythms of the community that are already there. You don't have to start everything from scratch. So, for example, Paul would go into the synagogue, right? And it says, as was his custom, he entered the synagogue and reasoned there with them. So he's engaging in dialogue. That's one thing we found to be really, really important in public space. In fact, I've actually entered so many rhythms of so many different communities over the years that most of my church plants have come out of that. I've started churches in the open air. I've started them in Starbucks. I've started them in a recreation center around food. I've started them on university campuses with little debate groups. So you can start church, microchurch, almost anywhere in public space if you're entering the rhythms. In other words, it needs to make sense. And what I mean is, when Paul rolled through Philippi, he goes and joins a group of women that used to gather together. They were dyeing their cloth. Lydia was there. They would dye their cloth, then they would pray. Paul says, well, I'm a tent maker. I'm going to go enter that rhythm. That makes sense for me to be there. I'm going to pray with these ladies, and then I'm going to share Jesus with them. That is microchurch in public space. Then you see Paul on Mars Hill entering the rhythms of that community, not just the synagogue, but it could be anywhere. I have accidentally, because I've entered the rhythms of the community, I have accidentally started multiple churches. One was in Starbucks. I was working as a barista, and my district manager said, hey, we need some kind of community event. And I know you used to be a pastor. Is it possible that you could start something up? And so I decided I would do Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, because people would hear my accent. They would find out I used to be a preacher. And they said, well, look, would you mind talking to us sometime? Because I'm reading that, and that's really got me thinking about the Bible. And I never think about the Bible. In Wales, where I was planting, there was less than 1.3% of the people went to church. And so one night, I just decided, one night only, I wasn't trying to plant a church. I just decided to hold a discussion group, like a reading group, a one night only reading club around Da Vinci Code, because enough people asked me what it was about and what I thought. So we had a bunch of cakes, bunch of coffee. Of course, being an employee, I was able to get a rad discount and purchase it, but I cut them into fours, right? You hit church planner budget. But anyways, when we got that going, 30 people turned up, and I couldn't believe it. And at the end of the first night, they said, "Are we going to do it again?" And I said, "No, I wasn't planning on it." But when we did it the second night, 40 people turned up. They begged for it again. We did it a third night. And at the end of that third night, a woman said, "You know, I know we debunked Dan Brown, all of his weird stuff, but why don't we go through the real Gospels instead of the Gnostic Gospels?" And that became a church plant. And one of the other times, I mean, that was in Europe, but over in urban Long Beach, I actually didn't intend to start a church in the open air, but what happened was 9/11 was rolling around. It was a 10-year anniversary of 9/11. We were in urban Long Beach, I mean downtown urban, and we happened to be planting on the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. And what happened was that was a national holiday. So all of the government employees at Parks and Rec were not allowed to work. So they called us Friday night before we were starting this church plant, and they said, "Hey, Peyton, guess what? You can't meet here because we can't come into work. So you're gonna have to meet outside." So we raided the mothership, got all the easy ups, got all the folding picnic chairs to use for the Easter service. The mothership was a mega church. And we said, "Hey, you know what? We're just going to do an outside thing." Well, that day we had hundreds of people who looked and said, "Man, that's a 9/11 memorial service. Let's go to that." People just walking through the park, walking their dog. People stopped and stayed. I'm not a marketer. I didn't advertise this thing. We were just going to be there and have presence in there. I've always been a small, kind of low to the ground guerrilla warfare kind of church planner, but boom, it blew up. A lesbian raised her hand, came to faith that day. It was insane. And we determined that day, we're going to keep doing this. And we started an open air church. We did an open mic night in the Gay Coffee House right down the road. Just open mic. What do you think about this? Throwing topics out, letting people talk. We would buy everybody's coffee, right? Enter the rhythms like it was already a done thing at this coffee house, but we would host it. That became a micro church. So what I was going to say to you is, if you enter the rhythms that are already there and you learn to master public space, then you will begin to do what the apostles were doing. That's what they were masters at. Our mind always goes to Paul at Mars Hill, but that was just one example. Almost every single example of microchurch starting in the streets in the New Testament was an accident. So far, all of my examples have been accidental, but the reality is, with a bit of intentionality, you can still enter the rhythms of the community with a bit of forethought. You look at the giftings of the people around you and their passions and their burdens, and you can orchestrate mission to follow the flow of their gifts. We call that gift-driven ministry. And I wrote a lot about this in a book called Reaching the Unreached, Becoming Raiders of the Lost Art. The lost art is mastery of church planting and evangelism in public space, which is essential to microchurch planting. And so what we did was, one of our groups was a film club. Another one was we just continued a book club. Even another one, having 2 chefs in our church, the mayor asked us, "Would you start a cooking class for single unwed mothers because we're worried that their babies aren't getting proper nutrition?" That became a microchurch, and that led a bunch of young girls to Christ. Literally the sky is the limit. If you can learn to master the art of microchurch and public space, entering the rhythms of the community, and just being there, maintaining that presence, the Holy Spirit will do the rest.